My name is Ember Davis. I am 36 years old. My parents handed me a $500 check in the middle of my sister's $250,000 wedding reception at the Fairmont Copley Plaza in Boston. And as my mother pressed that thin envelope into my palm, she leaned in and whispered that it was all I deserved because they didn't invest in dead ends. I was standing in a hallway lined with Italian marble, wearing a $79 navy dress I'd found on the clearance rack at Marshall's, while just a few feet away, my sister was cutting a 5-tier cake that cost more than my first year of college tuition. Take a second to like and subscribe, because the look on my father's face when I walked out of that ballroom forever is the reason I'm finally ready to tell you what really happened behind those closed doors in Beacon Hill. I grew up in a New England world where everything was measured by how it looked from the sidewalk. Our house was a 5-bedroom colonial on a street where the hydrangeas were always pruned to the exact same height, and every family holiday was a performance of quiet, expensive perfection. My mother, Eleanor Davis, 63 years old, a retired luxury real estate broker who had spent 40 years selling the American dream to people who could afford the highest zip codes, ran our home like a balance sheet. To her, a daughter wasn't just a child. She was an asset that either appreciated or became a liability. My older sister, Beatrice Davis, 39, a senior corporate defense attorney at a top-tier firm in the financial district, was the pride of the portfolio. She moved through life with the calculated grace of someone who had never been told no, mainly because our mother had spent 3 decades making sure every door was already open for her. Then there was me. I was the child who preferred the silence of a library to the noise of a country club mixer, the one who saw the world through the details that everyone else missed. That trait eventually led me to my career as a senior healthcare compliance auditor for the Massachusetts Department of Public Health. It is a job that requires a high level of authority and a zero tolerance for errors, spent primarily in the unseen corners of hospitals, ensuring that federal laws are followed and patient safety is never sacrificed for profit. It is essential work, but to my mother, it was invisible. I think most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know exactly what it costs when you make that calculation. You sit at the mahogany table eating pot roast that always tastes like unsaid expectations, and you realize you've become a ghost in your own home. At our Sunday dinners, my mother would spend 40 minutes discussing my sister's billable hours or her latest litigation victory. When she finally turned to me, her voice would drop into a tone of forced politeness, asking how the paperwork was going, as if I spent my days filing folders instead of holding the power to decertify entire medical facilities. The hierarchy was most visible in the things they bought for us. For my sister's 30th birthday, they had surprised her with a white BMW X5, a reward, my mother said, for her making a junior partner. For my 30th, my father, Arthur Davis, 65, a retired civil engineer who had spent his life building bridges but could never seem to build a defense for his own daughter, had stood by while my mother co-signed for a 2021 Toyota Camry. It was presented as a gift, but it was actually a leash. I paid every cent of the $380 monthly payment, but because my credit was thin, their names remained on the title like a legal claim to my independence. I met Caleb Reed on a Tuesday afternoon at a small coffee shop near the State House. He was an infrastructure inspector, a man who spent his days checking the things that kept people safe without them ever knowing he was there. He was 35, self-made, and carried himself with a steady, quiet confidence that didn't need a law degree or a designer suit to feel real. He'd put himself through school by working double shifts at a shipping yard, and when he looked at me, he didn't see an asset or a liability. He saw a woman who worked just as hard as he did to keep the world from falling apart. My mother found out about my relationship with a manual laborer, her words, during a Sunday meal that I will never forget. We were having baked cod and asparagus, and the air in the dining room felt heavy. She set her silver fork down with a sharp click against the china and asked if it was true that I was seeing someone who inspected dirt for a living. My sister let out a small, sharp laugh that she didn't even try to hide. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest, but for the first time, I didn't look down at my plate. I told her that he was a professional who kept the city standing. My mother just sighed, a long, weary sound, and said that she supposed some people were just satisfied with the baseline of life. The contrast became unbearable when my sister got engaged to a hospital administrator from an old money family in Cape Cod. The wedding planning became a full-time occupation for my mother, a $250,000 production at the Fairmont Copley Plaza. They flew in orchids from Ecuador and hired a string quartet from the Boston Symphony. My role in the wedding was essentially that of an usher. I was assigned to stand by the mahogany guest book stand and direct people toward the ballroom, making sure I stayed out of the professional photographs. My mother had told me, quite plainly, that since my friend wouldn't have the right attire for the black tie event, it might be better if he only came for the very end of the night. I stood at that guest book stand for 3 hours, greeting people who looked through me as if I were part of the damask wallpaper. I saw my mother moving through the crowd in champagne-colored silk, her face glowing with the kind of pride she had never once directed at me. When the reception was in full swing, she signaled for me to follow her into a quiet side hallway. I thought, for one foolish second, that she was going to thank me for helping. Instead, she reached into her clutch, pulled out a white envelope, and handed it to me. "I know you've been asking about your own future," she said, her voice as cold as the Atlantic in February. "I don't want you to think we've forgotten you. This is a contribution for your own wedding, whenever that might happen. It's for $500. And Ember, I want you to understand that this is all you deserve. We've decided that our major investments should go toward the members of this family who have a future we can actually see. We don't invest in dead ends." I looked down at that check. $500. My sister's rehearsal dinner alone had cost $20,000. It wasn't about the money. It was about the label. I felt the heat rise in my face, a mixture of being gutted and a sudden, sharp clarity. I didn't cry. I just folded that check, put it in my pocket, and walked back into the ballroom to find the man who was waiting for me. As we walked toward my Toyota Camry in the valet line, I realized that the leash wasn't just made of a co-signed loan. It was made of my own silence. And as we drove away from the lights of the Fairmont, I knew that the first thing I had to do was cut that chain, no matter how much it cost me. By 7 the next morning, my phone was a buzzing reminder of the world I had just walked away from, filled with 12 missed calls from my father and 3 biting texts from my sister, while the silence from my mother was louder than any ringtone she could have chosen. I sat at our small Formica kitchen table, the one we'd bought at an estate sale in Jamaica Plain because it was all we could afford, and I stared at the coffee going cold in my mug, while Caleb sat across from me with his laptop already open to the refinancing portal of a local credit union. I kept thinking about how I had stayed quiet for nearly a decade, telling myself that my silence was a form of loyalty. But looking at the interest rates on that screen, I finally understood that my silence had only ever been a down payment on my own unhappiness. I kept my mouth shut for 11 years because I told myself my mother needed peace more than she needed the truth. And I think most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know exactly what it costs when you make that calculation. You realize the people you were protecting were never planning to protect you in return. My father, Arthur, finally called me around noon, and for the first time in my life, his voice didn't sound like the civil engineer who could solve any structural problem. It sounded like a man whose own foundation was crumbling. He didn't ask how I was or if I had a place to go. He asked why I had embarrassed my mother in front of the Board of Trustees for the Mass General Hospital System, people she had spent 20 years trying to impress. I stood in my small kitchen, looking at the chipped paint on the windowsill, and I asked him a question I'd been holding since I graduated from Boston University. I asked him where the $20,000 from my grandmother's education trust had gone, the money that was supposed to be my down payment on a starter home. There was a silence on the line so heavy I could hear the clock ticking in their Beacon Hill hallway. And then that they had borrowed it to cover the down payment on my sister's luxury condo in Seaport because she needed the right address to attract the right clients for her firm. He told me they just assumed my government salary meant I didn't have the same needs as a defense attorney, as if my life was something that could be subtracted to make hers look more complete. I sat there on that worn-out linoleum floor, listening to the man who was supposed to be my guardian explain why my future had been sacrificed to polish my sister's reputation. If you think you know what it feels like to watch your own parents treat your hard work like a subsidy for someone else's life, tell me if you would have stayed quiet as long as I did. Like and subscribe. Because the refinancing papers I signed 10 minutes later were only the first thing I intended to tear out of their hands. The credit union in Somerville approved the transfer 48 hours later, and though the interest rate was nearly 8%, the feeling of seeing my mother's name stripped off that legal title felt like breathing in a room where the air had finally cleared. My sister, Beatrice, sent a final text that Wednesday, telling me that I had ruined her reception and that everyone in our social circle was asking where the difficult daughter had gone. I didn't reply to her, just as I didn't reply to my mother's voicemail reminding me that the family silver was being moved to my sister's house for safekeeping, now that I had proven I couldn't be trusted with the family's image. It was a 12-piece set of sterling silver that had belonged to my grandmother, the only thing I had ever asked to keep. And hearing that it was being handed over to the daughter who already had everything felt like a final eviction from the family history. I spent the rest of that week packing my life into cardboard boxes I'd scavenged from the liquor store down the street. It didn't take long to realize how little I actually owned that hadn't been filtered through their approval or their generosity. I had my compliance manuals, my laptop, and a cactus that Caleb had bought me when I passed my senior auditor exam, the only thing in my apartment that had grown without a trust fund or a co-signer. I'd already put in my 2-week notice at the Department of Public Health, and my supervisor, a man who had seen 30 years of state bureaucracy, just shook my hand and told me that Boston wasn't big enough for the kind of integrity I was carrying. We chose Charlotte, North Carolina because Caleb had done the math on his tablet while sitting on our air mattress. He showed me the startup ecosystem, the lack of state income tax, and the fact that a 2-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood cost less than a studio in Southie. It was a city that didn't know the Davis name, a place where a healthcare compliance auditor was seen as a professional asset rather than a clerical worker. The morning we left, the Massachusetts sky was a bruised shade of gray, and as I pulled the Honda out of the driveway, I saw my father standing by the mailbox in my rearview mirror, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. He didn't wave, and I didn't stop, because I knew that if I looked back now, the gravity of that house would pull me right back into the silence that had almost swallowed me whole. The I-95 South felt like a long, paved apology for every year I had spent waiting for a seat at a table that was never meant for me. And by the time we crossed the Potomac, the air had changed, growing warmer and thicker with the scent of damp earth and the promise of a humidity that didn't care about Beacon Hill's social standards. Caleb drove most of the way, his hand resting steady on the gear shift of my Toyota Camry, and every time I looked at him, I realized he was the only person who had ever asked if I was okay, without checking to see if my answer might embarrass the family. I think most of us who have gotten a phone call that split our life into before and after know that feeling when you finally sit down in a car you paid for, and for the first time, the room around you doesn't look like it's waiting for you to fail. We stopped at a Waffle House somewhere in Virginia at 3 a.m, the kind of place where the light is too bright and the coffee tastes like burnt earth. And Caleb just sat there watching me eat a plate of hash browns like it was the most important thing I'd done all year. He didn't ask me to explain why I was crying into my paper napkin, and he didn't tell me that I was being difficult. He just pushed his own coffee toward me and told me to take the first sip because I looked like I needed the warmth more than he did. I stood there thinking about my father, Arthur, and how he used to show his love in the quiet, unremarkable ways that my mother always overlooked, like making sure my car had a full tank of gas before I drove back to the State House, or leaving the porch light on when I was working double shifts. My father never said he was proud of me in so many words, but he said it by asking how my week was and actually waiting for the answer. And I think most women who have raised a family know that kind of love, the kind that never announces itself, the kind that is never dramatic, and the kind that is never fully appreciated until the people who gave it are gone or silent. I realized then that I had spent 30 years trying to earn a love that was loud and expensive, while the only love that actually mattered was the one that sat with me in a fluorescent-lit diner at 3 a.m. Our first apartment in Charlotte was a one-bedroom on East Moorhead Street, and it had warped hardwood floors and a window that looked out onto a dog park instead of a manicured colonial lawn. We didn't have a bed, so we slept on an air mattress that we'd bought at a Target in Maryland, and the first night, the silence of that apartment felt so heavy, I could hear the diesel engines of the trucks on the nearby interstate. I kept thinking about my sister's Italian marble kitchen and the Sub-Zero fridge my parents had bought her with the money that should have been my trust fund, and for a split second, I felt that familiar weight in my stomach, wondering if my mother was right, wondering if I was just a dead end who had traded a life of prestige for a whistle in an air mattress. But then the morning light hit the bare white walls, and I saw Caleb already sitting on the floor with his laptop open, looking for infrastructure projects in the Piedmont area. And I realized that freedom has a specific taste. It's bitter and thin, but it's yours. I started working the next Monday as a freelance compliance consultant, cold calling small clinics and hospices in the Charlotte area that couldn't afford a full-time auditor but were terrified of a federal inspection. I sat at a folding card table I'd found in the basement of our building, and I told myself that every billable hour I earned was a brick in a house that my mother could never touch. The smell of the city was different from Boston. It smelled like red clay, honeysuckle, and the exhaust of a city that was too busy growing to worry about who your grandfather was. By the end of our first month, we had cleared enough for the security deposit and a solid oak bed frame from a consignment shop, and when I finally laid down on a mattress that didn't whistle, I felt a kind of peace that I hadn't known since I was a little girl. I had my coffee on the small balcony every morning, watching the neighbors walk their dogs, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of what the family lawyer or the real estate listings might say. I was 36, I was in a city that didn't know my name, and I was finally starting to believe that I was worth more than a $500 insult. But the peace of a new city is a fragile thing, especially when the people you left behind still have your number. And it only took 3 weeks for the vibration of my phone on that folding table to bring the gravity of Boston right back into my living room. I stared at the name on the screen, Eleanor Davis, and I felt my stomach drop the way it does when you hear a fire alarm in a building you thought was safe. I hadn't spoken to her since the night of the wedding, and for 21 days I had lived in a world where her voice didn't dictate my worth. Most of us have gotten a phone call that split our life into before and after, the kind where you sit down without planning to, and afterward the room looks different. And as I pressed the phone to my ear, I realized I was holding my breath as if I were still that little girl waiting for a grade on a math test. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask if I was safe in a city 1,700 miles away. She just asked if it was true that I was looking at commercial lease agreements for a business that didn't even have a registered LLC yet. I stood there thinking. I stayed quiet for longer than I should have, keeping my mouth shut because I told myself it would get better. But hearing her voice now, I realized that my silence had only ever been permission for her to keep hurting me. Her voice was flat and measured, the same tone she used with real estate developers who didn't bring the right escrow paperwork. And she told me that if I didn't return to Massachusetts by the end of the month, she would be calling the auto lender to remove her name from the cosign agreement. She knew that as a senior healthcare compliance auditor starting a new life, I needed that vehicle to reach the rural clinics and rehab centers that were my only source of income. And she was betting that the fear of losing my mobility would be enough to bring me back to my seat at the corner of her table. She told me that since I was choosing to live like a stranger, she would be calling the bank on Monday morning to make sure the only thing I had to my name was taken away before I could even pay my first utility bill. If that breaks something in you the way it broke something in me, tell me if this sounds like someone you know. Like and subscribe, because hearing my own mother try to destroy my credit while I was eating peanut butter out of a jar just to stay afloat is a moment I will never be able to unhear. I let the silence hang between us for a long time, listening to the static of a long-distance connection that felt more honest than any conversation we'd had in a decade. I told her, my voice as steady as the concrete pillars Caleb inspected for a living, that she couldn't unilaterally remove herself from a legal co-signed loan, and that I had already initiated a refinance through a North Carolina credit union. The silence on her end was different this time. It wasn't the silence of power, but the silence of someone who reaches for a leash and finds that the collar has already been slipped. She told me that I was being ungrateful for the $18,000 of credit they had loaned me, as if the interest I had paid with my own taxable income didn't count because it hadn't come from a trust fund. I stayed on the line just long enough to hear her say that I was making a mistake I could never come back from, that the Davis name meant something in New England, and it would mean nothing in the South. I didn't tell her that nothing was exactly what I was looking for. A place where my value wasn't a calculation based on my sister's billable hours, or the appraisal of a house I would never inherit. After I hung up, I walked into the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, looking at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror and realizing that for the first time in 36 years, I wasn't waiting for her to finish her sentence. I went back to that folding table, opened my laptop, and I didn't look at Boston real estate. I looked at the Texas Secretary of State website, and I started the paperwork for Davis Compliance Consulting, LLC. I used our last $700 to pay the filing fees and the registered agent costs, and as I clicked the submit button, I felt a sharp, cold jolt of fear that was immediately replaced by a feeling of weightlessness. I was a senior healthcare compliance auditor with no safety net, no family backing, and a mother who was currently telling our entire neighborhood in Beacon Hill that I had suffered a nervous breakdown. But as Caleb walked through the door with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of groceries from the discount market, I realized that the dead end my mother saw was actually the beginning of a road she wasn't invited to travel. I didn't know then that my sister's old money marriage was already starting to show its first cracks, or that the hospital system her husband managed would soon be the primary target of the very first federal audit I would ever lead. Charlotte in August was a thick, humid weight that settled over the Queen City like a damp wool blanket. But the heat felt honest in a way the chilled ballrooms of New England never did. And as I walked to my car every morning to drive to small-town clinics in places like Gastonia or Concord, I realized that the sweat on my brow was the first thing I had ever truly earned without a family signature. I spent my days in the back offices of rural healthcare providers, digging through electronic health records, coding sheets, and Medicare billing cycles to find the errors that could cost them their federal funding. And I found a strange kind of peace in the objectivity of the law. The way a regulation doesn't care who your parents are or how many crystal chandeliers hang in your foyer. I think most women who have raised a family in America, who went to church on Sundays, who kept their feelings quiet for decades, and who sacrificed more than they were ever thanked for, know the feeling of working quietly in the background, doing the invisible labor that keeps the family from falling apart. And then one day you realize that no one was ever going to say thank you because they had already decided your effort was just part of the furniture. I sat at our estate sale kitchen table every night, which had now become the headquarters for Davis Compliance Consulting. And I learned that black beans, white rice, and optimism could stretch much further than my mother's $500 insult ever could. The table was where everything important happened. It was my office, our dining room, and the place where Caleb and I would sit in the blue light of our laptops, planning a life that didn't require anyone else's permission. Caleb would come home from his infrastructure inspections, his high-visibility vest and work boots caked in Carolina red clay, and he would sit beside me and help me proofread compliance reports while we shared a single pot of coffee to save on the grocery bill. There is a tenderness in the way a person supports you when there is nothing to gain from it. The kind of quiet love that shows up in the way he made sure my laptop charger was always plugged in, or how he'd leave the porch light on so I wouldn't feel so alone in the silence of a new city. I kept thinking about my mother, Eleanor, and how she used to say that creativity was a luxury and stability was a responsibility. But as I signed my first $4,000 retainer with a regional nursing home network in Matthews, I realized that real stability isn't something someone gives you. It's something you build with your own hands, one billable hour at a time. I didn't go looking for my sister's Instagram feed, but the algorithm of the New England social circle has a way of finding you even when you've moved 1,000 miles away. And one evening, while I was waiting for a HIPAA data file to download, a photo of her new Seaport kitchen appeared on my screen. It was a minimalist masterpiece of white quartz and brushed gold, bought with the down payment my parents had borrowed from my grandmother's residual trust. And my sister was standing there in a designer loungewear set, smiling a smile that looked increasingly brittle around the edges. I saw the comments from her corporate law firm colleagues, the emojis of champagne flutes and luxury brands, and for the first time in 36 years, I didn't feel the sharp sting of jealousy. I felt a profound sense of distance, as if I were looking at a historical artifact from a civilization I no longer belonged to. A world where your worth was tied to the appraisal of your countertop rather than the integrity of your work. Most of us who grew up in families like that know what it means to keep your mouth shut at the dinner table. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you've learned that saying it costs more than it's worth. By the end of my 8th month in North Carolina, my credit score had climbed to 740, and the refinance of the Toyota Camry through the Charlotte Federal Credit Union was finally complete, meaning my mother's name was officially scrubbed from my life like a stain on a linoleum floor. I had 6 retainer clients, a commercial business license, and enough in my checking account to buy a real mahogany desk that didn't wobble when I typed. I realized that my mother's dead end had actually been a necessary exit to a life I actually wanted to live, one where I didn't have to apologize for the space I took up or the professional authority I had earned through years of unseen labor. I was finally beginning to believe that the fire matters more than the money, and that the only thing more dangerous than a woman with nothing to lose is a woman who has finally realized she has everything to gain. But as I was closing my laptop for the night, a package arrived via FedEx from a legal firm in Boston that didn't have my mother's name on it, and inside was a single document that would force me to choose between the peace I had built in Charlotte and the justice my father had spent 30 years being too quiet to fight for. I sat in the morning light of my East 6th Street office, the shadow of my company logo stretching across the polished concrete floor like a finger pointing back toward the life I had escaped. And I realized that the Department of Justice wasn't just asking for a healthcare auditor. They were asking for the one person who knew exactly where the Davis family buried their secrets. The preliminary audit notice outlined a systemic billing fraud involving millions of dollars in Medicare overcharges, and as I scrolled through the digital spreadsheets they had sent as a secure attachment, I saw the signatures of the hospital administration team that included my sister's husband. I think most of us who grew up in families that valued keeping the peace know what it feels like when the truth finally starts to crack the surface. You realize that all those years of being told you were difficult were just a way to keep you from noticing that the successful members of the family were the ones actually breaking the rules. I stayed quiet for 11 years, telling myself that my mother's pride was more important than my own voice. But as I looked at the fraudulent billing codes on my screen, I understood that my silence had been a subsidy for a hospital system that was built on deception. The news from Boston began to arrive in fragments, not through the official legal channels, but through the panicked whispers of the New England social circle that my mother had spent her life cultivating. My sister's Cape Cod dream was the first thing to show its fault lines, as the real estate market in the Seaport district began to soften, and the interest rates on their jumbo mortgage started to outpace her husband's chief of staff salary. I heard from a former colleague at the Department of Public Health that my sister's husband was already being questioned about procurement irregularities, and that the Vera Wang wedding and the $250,000 reception were starting to look less like a celebration and more like a publicity stunt for a career that was built on quicksand. I kept thinking about my grandmother's sterling silver and how my mother, Eleanor, had handed it to the daughter who already had everything, and I realized that they had traded a century of family history for a reputation that was currently being liquidated by a federal investigation. My father, Arthur, called me on a Tuesday evening while I was sitting on my balcony, watching the Charlotte skyline begin to glow with the electric gold of a city that was too busy building its future to care about the old money failures of the North. He sounded like a man who had spent 30 years holding his breath and had finally run out of air. He told me that my mother hadn't left her Beacon Hill bedroom in 3 days, and that the neighbors were starting to notice the lack of gardeners on the colonial lawn. He didn't ask me to come home for a holiday or a brunch. He asked if I would consider reviewing some private financial documents for the family, a request that was really a plea for me to use my professional authority to save the people who had told me I was a dead end. I stood there looking at my hands that had spent a decade doing the invisible labor of compliance auditing, and I realized that they finally understood that the daughter who drew pictures and filed paperwork was the only one who actually knew how to read the legal blueprint of their destruction. I think most women who have raised a family know this feeling. You see exactly what's happening, you've seen it for years, and you stay quiet because you tell yourself your silence is protecting someone you love. But then you realize that the person you were protecting has already sold your inheritance to pay for a life they didn't earn. My sister Beatrice finally called me for the first time since the night she told me I'd ruined her reception, and her voice didn't sound like a senior corporate defense attorney. It sounded like a frightened child who had finally realized that her billable hours couldn't buy her way out of a federal subpoena. She spoke about family loyalty and the Davis name, using the same linguistic armor my mother had used for decades, but I just sat at my mahogany desk and listened to the silence between her sentences. I told her, my voice as calm as the North Carolina morning, that integrity isn't a family favor, and that my senior healthcare compliance license didn't come with a loyalty clause for people who had drained my trust fund to pay for their own vanity. The hospital system in Massachusetts was eventually hit with a $75 million federal fine, and the chief of staff position that my parents had bragged about at every Sunday dinner was terminated with cause, leaving my sister with a 5-bedroom colonial she couldn't afford and a BMW X5 that was now a liability instead of a trophy. I watched the Boston Business Journal headlines from my office in Charlotte, realizing that the market collapse of their social standing was the only thing that could finally force my mother to look at the daughter she had dismissed. I stayed in the South, focusing on Davis Compliance Consulting LLC and the startup ecosystem that had welcomed me when my own family had closed the door. But the gravity of the audit was still pulling me toward a final reckoning. I didn't know then that the Austin Business Journal was already preparing to nominate me for their 40 under 40 list, or that the gala where they would announce it would be the first time I would see my mother standing in the back of a room, looking at me with the kind of silence that only comes from a total loss of power. I spent that weekend at a lake house outside of Mooresville with Caleb, watching the sunset over the Piedmont and smelling the pine needles and the cooling earth. There is an ordinary, unremarkable love in the way a person makes sure your life jacket is buckled, or how they remember exactly how you like your morning coffee. And I realized that this was the life my mother thought was a baseline, a life where you are safe, you are seen, and you don't have to win a litigation to be loved. I felt the weight of my grandmother's legacy shifting in my heart, and I knew that while I couldn't get the silver back, I was building something much more durable than a 12-piece set of sterling. I was building a life that was compliant with my own integrity, and as the Department of Justice prepared to fly me back to Boston for the deposition, I realized that I wasn't going back as a difficult daughter. I was going back as the primary expert witness of my own life. By the time the Charlotte Business Journal announced their annual 40 Under 40 list in November, Davis Compliance Consulting, LLC, had moved into a 3-room suite in a restored brick textile mill on the South End, and the revenue numbers on my QuickBooks dashboard were no longer a dream I whispered about on an air mattress. They were a documented reality that I had built without a single cent of my parents' old money. I had 4 full-time employees, a reputation as the most thorough auditor in the Carolinas, and a desk made of reclaimed walnut that sat under a modern light fixture that threw long, steady shadows across my professional awards. I think most women who have raised a family in America know the specific kind of dignity that comes when you stop waiting for someone to give you a seat at the table, and you realize you have already built a much better one in a room they aren't invited to. I kept thinking about my mother, Eleanor, and how she had spent my childhood telling me that conformity was the only path to stability. But as I adjusted my tailored charcoal blazer in the mirror before the gala, I realized that the only stability worth having is the kind that survives when the reputations of everyone around you have finally defaulted. The 40 Under 40 Gala was held at the Westin Charlotte, a high-rise tower of glass and steel that looked out over the stadium where the Panthers play, and the room was filled with the kind of fast-paced energy that defines the New South, a world of fintech founders, healthcare executives, and infrastructure developers who didn't care about Beacon Hill lineage. I arrived with Caleb, who looked like a man who was finally comfortable in his own skin, wearing a navy suit we'd bought at a boutique in South Park, and a smile that told me he'd been waiting for this moment since that first cup of coffee near the State House. As we checked in at the reception desk, I saw a woman standing near the bar in a champagne-colored silk blouse that was so familiar, it made my heart hammer against my ribs like a trapped bird. It was my mother, standing beside my sister Beatrice, both of them looking like artifacts that had been misplaced in a city that was moving too fast for their New England silence. I found out later that my mother had followed my success through the Charlotte Business Journal's digital edition, and she had used her remaining social leverage to secure an invitation to the gala, hoping to reclaim a daughter she had already liquidated. I stood there in the spotlight of that ballroom, looking at the woman who had once told me I was a dead end, while she was currently facing a federal subpoena for the fraudulent billing codes she'd spent 20 years ignoring. If you've ever had to make a choice like that, tell me if you think she made the right call. Like and subscribe. Because the deposition I had signed just 2 hours earlier in my lawyer's office was about to change the Davis name forever. I walked toward our table at the front of the room, and I didn't look back at the shadows in the rear section where my mother and sister were seated, because I knew that their presence wasn't a sign of reconciliation. It was a sign of hunger. Earlier that week, I had discovered the final creative betrayal that my mother had orchestrated. A digital file of my sister's reception video that had been professionally edited to remove every single shot of me, even the moments where I was standing right beside the guest book stand. She had literally erased my presence from the family history to ensure the aesthetic of the Davis legacy remained focused on the daughter who was a senior corporate defense attorney. I stood there thinking, I kept my mouth shut for years because I was afraid of being the one who caused trouble. But as I saw my name on the gala program, I realized that my silence hadn't protected the family. It had only protected the facade of a life that was already hollow inside. When they called my name for the Compliance and Ethics Award, the room erupted in a kind of genuine applause that I hadn't known existed in Boston. And as I walked to the stage, the spotlight was so bright I couldn't see my mother's face in the back of the room anymore. I spoke about the integrity of unseen labor, the authority of documented facts, and the American promise that your value is defined by what you build, not by what you were given. I didn't mention the $500 check or the stolen trust fund, because those things were no longer the story. They were just the scaffolding I had used to climb to a height my mother couldn't reach. After the ceremony, my mother tried to approach me in the VIP lounge, her hands shaking as she reached for a champagne flute. But I didn't wait for her to apologize or explain why she had edited me out of her life. I just looked her in the eye and told her that Davis Compliance was now the only thing associated with our name that wasn't under federal investigation. And then I turned back to Caleb and the life we had built together in the North Carolina sun. The gala ended with a standing ovation for the nominees, and as we walked out to the valet line, I realized that the weightlessness I had felt when I first filed my LLC paperwork was now a permanent part of my foundation. My mother and sister were left standing on the sidewalk, waiting for a rideshare they couldn't quite figure out how to order, while I drove away in a Toyota Camry that was 100% mine. The federal investigation into the Massachusetts hospital system concluded with a $75 million settlement that effectively ended the career of my sister's husband and stripped him of his medical license, leaving my sister, Beatrice, to face the liquidation of the Seaport luxury condo that my mother had so proudly called a wise investment. It turned out that the old money prestige they had spent 40 years cultivating was nothing more than a facade built on systemic billing fraud and the unseen labor of people like me, who were never supposed to look too closely at the spreadsheets. My mother, Eleanor Davis, who had once stood in a ballroom of Italian marble and told me I was a dead end, now spends her days answering federal subpoenas in a house in Beacon Hill that is currently listed as short sale collateral. I think most of us who have watched a family legacy crumble know that the most painful part isn't the loss of the property or the status. It's the sudden, quiet realization that the reputation you were told to protect was never actually worth the sacrifice you were asked to make. I received a restitution check from the Department of Justice that returned every cent of my grandmother's trust fund, along with the accrued interest that my parents had tried to erase. And as I deposited that money into my business account, I realized that I wasn't just getting my inheritance back. I was getting my identity back from the people who had tried to price it at $500. Davis Compliance Consulting, LLC, has expanded into a 5,000 square foot office in the south end of Charlotte, and the reclaimed walnut desk I sit at every morning is a tangible piece of evidence that a woman who works in the invisible corners of the law can build a life that is much more durable than a 12-piece set of sterling silver. I have 12 full-time employees now, people who I pay fairly and treat with the professional respect I was denied for a decade. And on the wall behind my desk hangs the 40 Under 40 Award from the Charlotte Business Journal, its crystal edges catching the North Carolina sun and throwing small, steady rainbows across a room that no one in Boston ever thought I would occupy. My father, Arthur, finally made that trip to Charlotte last month, and we didn't go to a country club or a gala. We sat at a picnic table at a barbecue joint in Noda, the kind of place where the napkins are made of brown paper, and the only thing that matters is the quality of the work in front of you. He sat there in his LL Bean flannel shirt, looking at the shadow of my company logo on the sidewalk, and he finally handed me a handwritten letter that didn't have my mother's cursive or her legalistic conditions anywhere on the page. He told me, his voice shaking with the weight of 30 years of unspoken regret, that he had spent his life building bridges made of steel, while letting the bridge to his own daughter rust into nothing. And for the first time in my life, he didn't check his watch or his newspaper. He just looked at me and said he was proud of the woman I had become, in spite of the silence he had offered me. I think most of us who have lived through a family betrayal know that justice doesn't always look like a courtroom verdict or a financial settlement. Sometimes, it just looks like the right people finally sitting in the right chairs at a table where everyone is seen. It's funny how the very thing my mother thought would destroy me, the refusal to fund my life, was the fire I needed to build a life that she can no longer reach. I realized that the dead end she saw was actually just the end of her authority over my future. And as I looked at my father eating brisket on a paper plate, I knew that we were finally on level ground, where a daughter isn't an asset, and a father isn't a witness to his own cowardice. I sleep through the night now, in a house that I bought with my own billable hours, and the only gravity I feel is the steady, quiet weight of a life that is compliant with my own integrity. I have my coffee on the back porch every morning now, and the only sounds I hear are the ones I choose to let in: the birds, the neighbor's dog, the wind in the trees. And I am not afraid of what the phone might say, because I finally know that my value doesn't come from a $500 check, but from the fire I carried when no one else was willing to hold the light. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And like and subscribe, because there is always someone sitting quietly in a house somewhere right now, holding something painful they have never said out loud. And maybe this is the story that helps them understand they are not alone.